There are places that were never meant to heal, only to listen. Places where silence isn't absence, but appetite. Tonight, S story takes us deep inside the abandoned Salt River Sanatorium, a place whispered about 4 decades where 6 Resonant Wards were locked away, and 1 key has just been found. What waits behind those doors isn't alive, but it isn't dead either. It is sound itself, hungry, patient, waiting for someone foolish enough to answer. This is the story of the Resonant Ward. The envelope arrived without a stamp, without a name, without any mark that suggested it had ever passed through a post office. Just a thin, pale rectangle of paper slipped beneath my apartment door. I found it waiting on the floor when I came home that Tuesday evening. Its corners curled slightly as though it had been pressed by something heavier on the way here. At first, I thought it was another flyer. My building collected them the way old ships collected rust. Pizza deals, discount movers, language tutors. But the weight wasn't right. It sagged differently in my hand, heavier at one end. When I tore the flap, something metallic slid against the paper with a dry rasp. A key, not a modern key, not the neat kind stamped for apartments or offices. This one was brass, pitted, rough around the edges, like it had been turned too many times in too many locks. Wrapped clumsily around it was a strip of gauze, stiff with something crystalline. Salt. It crumbled between my fingers, leaving a bitter tense on my skin. I lifted the key under the kitchen light. 3 characters had been pressed into the bow. RW6. The letters were shallow, uneven, as if stamped in haste or with a trembling hand. RW6, I said aloud. The sound startled me. It wasn't just the strangeness of finding a key in my apartment, but the familiarity of the initials, RW. They yanked loose a memory I had buried for years. Resonant Ward. My stomach turned cold. The Resonant Wards weren't just a rumor. They were part of the Salt River Sanatorium, a state-run hospital buried in the desert outside the city. My mother had worked there. She'd been one of its leading technicians, spending nights in labs filled with speakers, tuning forks, recording devices. She had once told me they were studying sound as medicine, but even at 14, I could hear the cracks in her voice when she said it. 15 years ago, she vanished there. I stared at the brass key until the edges blurred. My hands had begun to tremble. That was when my phone vibrated on the counter. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. At first, nothing. Then, the faint sound of someone breathing. A woman's voice, quiet, controlled, yet frayed at the edges. If you've got the key, you shouldn't be in your apartment. My grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? You need to go back to the hospital. The words clamped around my chest. What hospital? You know which one. I almost laughed. A bitter, nervous bark. If this is a prank, it's not funny. The voice didn't argue. Instead, the line filled with a sound so sharp I nearly dropped the phone. A tone thin at first, like feedback pressed through cloth, then deepening, until it felt like pressure inside my skull. My kitchen cabinets trembled. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed louder. The key in my other hand began to hum. I gasped, clutching it tight. "Stop!" The tone cut off instantly. "On the line?" The woman spoke again. "Your mother called it a hold frequency. It locks doors that aren't supposed to exist. RW6 is the last one. Midnight Maya. If you don't lock it, it opens itself." My throat tightened. "Who are you?" But the line had already gone dead. For a long while I just stood there, the phone still warm in my hand, the key heavy in the other. My apartment seemed to shrink around me, the hum of the fridge, the faint tick of the radiator, the distant siren outside. I'd always trusted sound. I'd made a life cataloging it. Podcasts, recordings. Sound was my anchor. But tonight, every noise felt corrupted, like the world had started speaking in a language I wasn't meant to understand. I set the key on the counter and paced, trying to breathe. Midnight. The analog clock over the sink read 9:12. I thought of my mother. The last year before she disappeared, she had changed. She started wearing earplugs even outside the lab. She walked through the apartment with headphones clamped over her ears, humming under her breath as if she was countering some sound only she could hear. She told me once, in a half-whisper, that sound can heal, but anything with edges can cut. I had been too young to understand, too angry to ask. When she vanished, they told me she had left a note. I never saw it. I told myself for years that maybe she had walked away from the sanatorium, from her research, from me. But the envelope on my counter said otherwise. By 9:20, I had stopped pacing. I picked up the key again, wrapped it back in the salted gauze, and slid it into my pocket. The drive out of the city took 40 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. Every song, every advertisement felt like a door I didn't dare open. The highway thinned into cracked asphalt, then into dirt. The desert rose around Thorn scrub, fences twisted with rust, dunes that glittered faintly in the moonlight. Salt River Sanatorium squatted in a depression, half hidden by a ridge of pale rock. The building had been abandoned for more than a decade, but it still looked alive in the moonlight. Two wings stretching from a central block, windows black and blank. Behind it, the satellite dish still loomed, pointing toward nothing, and the old water tower rusted like a sentinel. I parked on the shoulder and killed the lights. The chain-link fence was padlocked. A new lock, shiny and heavy, but locks never kept people out here. Ghost hunter kids, scavengers, thieves, they all got in. The padlock was easy. The fence was easier. Inside, the air changed immediately, cooler, thicker, as if sound itself had been muffled. The desert outside still hissed with wind and insects, but here, within the fence, the night pressed soft against my ears like velvet. I crossed the cracked courtyard, my flashlight beam jittering across broken tiles and chalky white deposits that looked like veins in the concrete. The main doors of the sanatorium had long since been smashed in, glass teeth still glittering on the floor. I stepped carefully through, The lobby smelled of dust and paper rot. Abandoned chairs hunched against the walls. A plastic plant stood frozen in its pot, its leaves brittle enough to snap at a touch. On the reception desk, under a warped plastic cover, a clipboard lay fused to the surface. Resonant Ward access log. My heart lurched. The handwriting across the top was unmistakable. My mother's. The R's were carved deep, too heavy, like she had pressed down hard to keep her hand from shaking. I leaned closer. The log listed 6 wards, RW1 through RW6. Each line showed in and out times. Some names I didn't recognize, some crossed out, but the final line, RW6, had both boxers empty. Never checked back in. I swallowed hard, the taste of salt still on my tongue. The left wing of the building led to exam rooms, observation windows, patient files. The right wing led to the labs, to the wards. I went right. Even in abandonment, the corridors carried a strange geometry. The air pressed heavier. My own footsteps dulled too quickly, as though the walls absorbed the sound. The further I walked, the more the silence thickened, layering itself until it became difficult to breathe. The first ward door appeared at the end of a long corridor. A steel plate above it read Resonant Ward 1. Tarnished but legible. The door itself was thick, reinforced with 2 heavy latches sealed shut. An intercom sat above it, clogged with dust. I pressed my ear against the cold metal. At first, nothing. Then so faint I might have imagined it a hum. Not a tone, but the absence of one. A silence that pressed back. I jerked away, heart hammering. RW2 2 was the same. RW2 3 2. Each door seemed heavier than the last, the air thickening as I passed. By the time I reached RW5, the hair on my arms had risen. The plate bore 3 diagonal scratches, like someone had dragged metal across it. The latches hung open. I set my palm against it. The surface was cold, too cold, and the scent of copper filled my nose. I forced myself to step back. Not this one, not yet. Finally, I reached RW6. The door sat at a bend in the corridor, so anyone who opened it would be vulnerable from both sides. The plate above was darker, almost black with age. The intercom had been replaced at some point newer than the others. Wires fresher. Someone had wanted this ward monitored longer than the rest. The latches were open. The keyholes gaped. I took the brass key from my pocket. Under my flashlight, the stamped letters glowed like embers. RW6. My throat was dry. I slid the key into the lock. The intercom crackled. A voice bled through, male, steady, too careful, like an old radio announcer. This is Ward 6 Control. Identified. I froze. Who is this? If you have the key, the voice replied. You're either technician or bait. My breath hitched. I'm Maya. Silence. Then, your mother taught me to tune the lattice. The world tilted. She's alive. No, the voice said softly. Not anymore. The building exhaled around me, the concrete groaning. My hands stayed on the key, and then the intercom whispered a word that made my blood run cold. Hungry. The corridor beyond RW6 felt like a lung holding its breath. The air pressed thick, cold against my skin, and for a moment I wasn't sure whether the shiver running down my spine came from fear or the building itself shifting around me. The voice on the intercom, the man who'd called himself Control, had gone silent. Only the faint hiss of static remained, but the word it had whispered last, hungry still, rang inside my skull like a struck bell. I gripped the brass key tighter, feeling the grooves of its teeth cut into my palm. "This is insane," I whispered, though speaking aloud felt like feeding something I couldn't see. I forced my legs to move. The hallway bent sharply after RW6, curving away from the hospital's familiar floor plan. The sanatorium's blueprints were etched in my memory. As a teenager, I had studied them obsessively, searching for any clue about where my mother had gone. But this passage didn't exist on any of them. The tiles underfoot changed as I walked first. Linoleum, cracked and dusty. Then a darker stone, porous like volcanic rock that absorbed every bit of sound I made. My footsteps landed, but didn't echo. It was as if the hallway swallowed the noise hole. My flashlight beam slid along the walls. Grooves had been cut into the stone, spiraling patterns that made my eyes blur. If I stared too long, they reminded me of waveforms, the jagged, rising, falling graphs I used to watch on my laptop when I edited recordings. Except these weren't drawn. They were carved, etched deeply, as though the rock itself had once been soft enough to mold by sound. I reached out before I could stop myself and pressed 2 fingers against one groove. It vibrated, not enough to be felt like machinery, but enough that the bones of my hand carried the tremor. A rhythm. A pulse. I jerked back. My fingertips tingled, and when I lifted them toward my face, I swore I could still hear something faint like a breath against my skin, echoing a fraction delayed. The stairwell, halfway down. The corridors split. To the left, a stairwell descended into darkness. Its steps, narrow, steep. To the right stretched more hallway, narrower, padded with old soundproofing foam now cracked and sagging, clinging stubbornly to the plaster. But straight ahead, mounted on the wall, was a small intercom unit. Its casing was newer than the rest of the building, less rust, less wear, the screws still gleaming. I approached slowly, lifted the flashlight. The intercom was dead. No crackle, no hum. I pressed the transmit button. Control, Rafe, whoever you are. Only silence. I tried again. This is Maya, technician, like you said. If you're... But as I turned to step away, the static surged back for a single second. A sharp burst, like biting into foil. Then silence again. The brass key in my pocket vibrated faintly, as though stirred by the sound. The voice behind me, the stairwell side. I froze, the hair rising on my arms. Slowly, I swung the flashlight beam back toward the steps. Nothing moved, but the shadows felt heavier. The staircase seemed deeper than it had moments before, as though the dark had stretched it further downward. I held my breath, and then, from the intercom, faint, but clear. "That's the one." I spun back. The light glared across the unit. "Rafe?" "Yes." His voice, faint, but recognizable. "Don't open it yet." My throat tightened. "Where are you?" "In the dish room. Below. If you want answers, that's where you'll find me." "How do I get there?" A pause. "By going down the stairs." I turned back to the stairwell. The shadows waited, thick as velvet. My flashlight beam sank only a few steps before it dissolved. I took one breath, then another. "If I go down, will I find you?" "You'll find what she left," Rafe said softly. "And myth? I last that long. The intercom died. The first steps." The silence around me stretched, taut, waiting. I stepped to the top of the stairwell. Stone steps dropped away into black. I sat 1 foot forward. The sound of my shoe striking stone landed and then vanished. No echo, no reverberation. It was as if the stairwell had eaten the sound. I swallowed hard. Stairs that eat sound lead deeper than foundations. I remembered from the notebook. My mother's words. I touched the bone conduction pads still strapped to my head, adjusting them. At first, nothing. Then a faint hum returned. Not from RW6 this time, but from the building itself. The low throb of stone carrying sound where air no longer could. I gripped the railing, slick with condensation, and descended. 1 flight. 2. The air grew damp, heavy, cooler with each level. My phone's clock flickered strangely. 11:12 jumped to 11:18. 6 minutes gone, though I'd only counted 40 steps. By the third flight, the walls sweated. Drops trickled down grooves etched in spirals, running together like tears. On the fourth landing, the air pressure shifted. The skin on my arms prickled, and then, faint, from somewhere far below, a pressure change. Not footsteps, not breath. Something larger, moving deeper still. I almost turned back, but the key in my pocket pulsed again, as though tugging me forward. The dish. The stairwell opened suddenly into a chamber lit by a single weak emergency bulb. Half dead, it buzzed just above the edge of hearing, casting light that seemed frail to reach the walls. At the center of the room stood a satellite dish, smaller than the one on the roof, but wired to it cables running upward through the ceiling like veins. Dust coated the dish, but as I stepped closer, I saw it pulse faintly, as though catching signals that shouldn't exist anymore. Beneath the dish, a figure stood. Rafe. He turned slowly at the sound of my approach, pale face, eyes ringed with exhaustion, lips moving as though he was humming something under his breath. His voice carried the same tone I'd heard through the intercom, a steady, thin note, holding something at bay. "You made it," he said, voice hoarse. "But the dish—" The dish whispered, and it whispered in my mother's voice. "Mia." The name fell out of the metal-like breath, leaving a lung. Maya. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The satellite dish at the center of the room had no right to sound like a person, much less like her, but my mother's voice, exact vowels. The slight dent at the beginning of my name that came from years of speaking English through a German childhood curled from the dish, Eskim cave face, as if the dust itself had found a mouth. I didn't take another step. The floor around the plinth was marked in a faint ring. Not chalk, not paint salt. I realized after a heartbeat, salt had crusted into a pale circle that shimmered where my flashlight beam passed. A boundary. A habit. A prayer someone had repeated until it became architecture. "Stay outside the ring," Rafe said, not quite turning. His shoulders cinched tight under a faded blue work shirt, the hum under his breath braided with the faint electrical buzz of the emergency bulb overhead. "It carries." Carries what? Names. He glanced at me but kept his voice low, as though the room were a church that tolerated the living. "And instructions. And anything you are careless enough to believe." The dish tilted. It did not rotate like a machine. It shifted, a slow animal motion that groaned along welds and old bolts, angling its shallow throat toward me. The cables that tethered it up through the ceiling throbbed once, as if a pulse had traveled from sky to ground and back again. "Maya?" it said again, sweeter, almost pleased with itself now that it had provoked my stillness. "Daughter?" "That isn't her," I said, because I needed the air to be full of a fact. "No," Rafe agreed. He spoke without letting go of his tone, riding it, shaping it. It learned her frequency before the lights went out upstairs. "Once a voice is inside the lattice, it does not leave." He lifted a hand steady, long fingers calloused. "Don't answer. Not with your name. Not with any word it can use to eat you." My mouth had already formed, I know. I swallowed it back and instead tightened the strap of the bone conduction set against my temples. Cold pads bit the skin just above my cheekbones and fed the building a slow thrum straight into bone. When I breathed through my nose, it sounded like the room was breathing through me. "Start with this," Rafe said, nodding at the headset. "Let it steady you. The ear will lie. Bone won't." The headset smoothed the chamber into layers. The high mosquito whine of the bulb, the low sway of air pulled through ducts that should have been dead. A middle register that had no business existing. A pressure where silence had congealed until it behaved like sound. "Your tone," I said, nodding at his throat. "The hold frequency. You've been doing that since I came down the stairs." He allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind that cost. "Your mother taught me." The hum, almost a thread, did not waver. "You can learn to push at the lattice without touching it, like leaning against a locked door with your back, not your hands. What is the lattice? The frame the ward uses to dress itself in what we think we are. He said it simply, a web woven from echoes. Don't glorify it and don't reduce it. It is not magic. It is not a recording. It is practice. The dish drifted a fraction closer. It would have looked like a trick of shadow in any other room. Here, the motion tugged the air. A fine gray skin of dust slid down the lip and puffed off into a cloud. Glimmering. Technician? The dish continued, trying the word on like a borrowed coat. Key? The brass key in my pocket shivered, the ridges of its teeth buzzing against the fabric like a trapped insect. I put my hand over it and felt the hum anchor as if grateful for the touch. Don't give it an inventory, Rafe said, eyes flicking to my pocket. Knowing what you carry is close enough to carrying you. I bent and put the notebook on the floor inside the beam of my light, the waxed paper cover dulled by grime but intact where the tape had kept desert air away. RW26. Lattice Cal. For MK only. The K in MK made something under my breastbone ache. My mother's hands, always too cold, writing my initials bold like a talisman. You found it, Rafe said, and his voice warmed away from the tone a fraction. Good. We will need it, Rafe, I said, the name careful in my teeth. What is this dish doing? Pretending to be a mouth, he said. But it's a mirror. It throws anything the room says until something answers. And when something answers, it has another thread to stitch into its net. He gestured with his chin toward a junction box fixed into the stone a meter from the plinth. New screws, old cable. That box ties this repeater to the old roof dish and the city relay. They never really shut anything down, you know. They just stopped watching the screens. I swept my light across the box. Someone had cleaned the plate recently. The dust bloom around it made a halo, the metal itself smeared by a palm. A knuckle had left a small crescent. I imagined him kneeling here, alone, hand braced while his other thumbed a screwdriver. Below you. He had set up in the ward corridor. He had been below me for years. What does the relay do? I asked. The dish had gone quiet, listening. Every system that still speaks to the city wakes at midnight and pings its dead parents, he said. Maintenance, inventory, network tests, old radios and new water meters, door controllers that should be rust. Hello, the city says. I'm here. The ones that can answer. Home. Your mother made a ward that learned the word home by listening to unsuccessful goodnights. Upstairs, in the corridor. The clock had said 11:18 when time forgot how to be a straight line. I looked now, 11:33. The midnight that wasn't a story anymore leaned closer. I thought the funding ended, I said, useless as hoping for the past to fold its sharp corners. The funding ended. The tools didn't. He tilted his head, and for a second his tone lifted a fraction as if to reach a higher rung, and then settled. I can only hold the lattice in one spot. That's why I needed you to turn the lock while I leave. You sent the key. He gave one tiny shrug that meant yes, and also I wish I hadn't had to. No one else would read her notes, or if they did, they wouldn't believe them. His mouth crooked. You will, because you already know how to listen to a room. She said that about you. She said. The words tried to hook into the soft parts of my throat. I cut the sentence off like a thread before it snagged and bled. The dish made a small, delighted sound, like metal smiling, she said. It repeated in my mother's rhythm, and then in her voice. You already know how to listen to a room, May. It wasn't the name that hurt, it was the May. Only she called me that. I pressed the heel of my hand hard into my sternum, until breath found its job again. Mira, I told myself, like a child repeating the right answer for the test. Not a mouth. Good, Rafe said, and for the first time the words sounded like his rather than the tones. Keep it simple. Things you can hold in one hand. I crouched on my heels and opened the notebook to the breadcrumbs page. The city in my head, the desert, the fence. The main doors receded. Here, under rock. My mother's notes were the only map that mattered. Tag the room with a name it will mispronounce. Find the transmitter that answers to nothing. Bring a second key if you can't bring a second person. You told me to find the transmitter that answers to nothing, I said. Upstairs, the intercom was dead until I turned away, and then it coughed. Down here, this dish is a mirror. Where's the transmitter? Behind that? He nodded toward the far wall where the cables thickened and dived into stone. There's a passive node cast into the concrete. It doesn't broadcast. It absorbs. It gives me a wall to lean against. He let the tone climb again, almost imperceptibly, and the emergency bulb steadied as if grateful. Will it answer me? It will insult you with how little it cares about your questions, he said. That is how it keeps me honest. Machines that answer make men think they are gods. He stepped carefully to the edge of the salt ring and pointed with his chin to a thin hairline fissure in the crust. Don't break that. It's old, I said, seeing the crack run like a dried river through the pail. How long have you been coming down here? His mouth hesitated before deciding on a number. Long enough to forget. I meant to stop. The dish exhaled. No air moved. But the pads on my temples told me the room's pressure had shifted the way a lung changes, the math of a chest without asking permission. The concave metal brightened as one large flake of dust fell and shattered into smaller, glittering planes. Technician, it said, choosing the syllables with relish. Daughter. A soft chime layered into the trio, like one drink too many beneath the tongue of the last word. Key had pleased it. Of course it had. Keys assume doors. Doors assume the other side. You said there's a tie to the city, I said to Rafe. If we fix this lock, will the Rila stop talking? It will still talk, he said, but it won't be heard. Not by this. His tone soft and sharpened at once, letting a small dissonance scrape at the lattice like a file against a burr. The dish flinched. The ward does not get bored. It gets patient. Teaching it to lose interest is our only kindness. What if it doesn't? Then we invent a better cruelty. He didn't smile when he said it. I believed him anyway. The dish took a different tack. Cold, it said, and the word came in my voice. Salt, left pocket. It had learned me leaning. My hand over the key a moment before. I ignored the spasm that ran across my diaphragm. Rafe whistled. A new note slicing through his hold like a thin blade. It has your outline. It will try to trace you until its pencil breaks. Do not hand it a sharper one. Understood, I said, though the word wanted to turn into something yearning like Mom if I let it. I didn't know we weren't. He sang he would never use that verb, but that's what it was. A singing with the instrument turned inside out and I moved with my mother ease, notebook open to the diagram of the repeater junction. The page showed a bolt layout I recognized and half a dozen pencil corrections that made me grin wrong in this wrong place. No, Miriam. My mother had written in the margin next to a neatly drawn resistor symbol. It is not a polite circuit. It cheats. Below it, in darker red, cheat back. I cheated. I loosened a grounding lug and slid a washer and skewed, so the path would carry a hair of charge to casing. I didn't sever anything. The last thing you do to something that is noisy is give it silence. I gave it bad listening instead. A connection that would add slur to every syllable the dish wanted to pronounce. The dish felt the insult and tried to sound offended like a human. Technician, it said, thickening the consonants until they tangled. The concavity wavered. The salt ring clinked softly in a single crystalline shiver, as if a distant train had walked by on light feet. Rafe's eyes flicked approval and then went back to the work of keeping tone. Sweat slicked his temples. I wondered whether he had simply stood here doing this for hours. 4 nights. 4 years. Practicing a resistance the way a monk practices not eating what will kill a vow. Tell me about her, he said after a minute. The question so simple my mouth wanted to give it everything. Not what she built. Who she was, that's not for here. I said, because I could smell the hook hidden in the innocence. But something small still spilled. She used to hum when she cooked. 3 notes. Not a song. A shape. The same 3 notes would show up in her graphs like a cracked plate ringing in another room. Rafe's hum bent in a way that told me he recognized mine. She taught the lab to listen to what wasn't crushing them. There were nights the machines wrote poems by accident because she let them. The dish liked this. Poems, it said greedily, stealing his exact angle of reverence and making it an ache. Stop beating it, I said, and he inclined his head in a tiny apology. The bulb sputtered. A line in my mother's notebook was underlined twice. At 2350, stand up. If you are already standing, stand more. I didn't know what more was until I felt at the moment the building gathered itself, as if someone had just reached a hand toward a sleeping animal and the animal decided whether to stay or bite. It's feeling for the relay, Rafe said. His tone had to work harder now. I heard it, the way you can hear fatigue graft itself to a voice, no matter the training. It listens ahead. Midnight is a gift you bring to it in a box, and it shakes the box before you put it down. He broke tone long enough to pass me a coil of wire and a small, savaged device, half dictaphone, half homemade oscillator with a cracked plastic faceplate. Hold this against the node, he said, tipping his chin at the passive slab behind the junction box. When you feel your bones get heavy, thumb the red switch and count out loud. 10 heartbeats. Exactly. You told me not to. Not names, he said. Numbers are rocks. They sink. The ward hates anything that refuses to be a story. I stepped around the outer curve of the salt ring and put my palm against the concrete where the cables vanished. The wall felt cooler, dense with purpose. A nothing lived here that had been taught to become a something only when fed. The device in my other hand warmed. I set its battered casing to the seam. You're sure? I asked. No, he said. Do it anyway. It would have been funny someplace else. Now, he said. I pressed the switch. It resisted like a tongue against a cold fence, and then gave. I felt it in my teeth first. A minute's change in pressure that made a hollow place behind my nose. As if the sinus insisted it had just climbed a mountain. The pads on my temples thrummed. The dish hissed like wet metal kissing a hot stove. 1, I said, and the counting dropped stones into the room. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Rafe took the count at 10 and yanked it like a rope. His tone reversed. A trick my ear didn't understand, like a violinist turning a note inside out. The dish tried to keep up. The lattice did not. The mirror suddenly showed its age. Again, he panted. Switch. I did. Numbers again. This time, the room tried to climb onto them as if they were not rocks but steps. I kept my voice flat, and the concrete under my palm stayed the one honest thing. On 10, the bulb overhead bloomed. In the brute light, Rafe looked older and younger at once. Older because the hummus strain had carved him out of himself. Younger because he had the careful joy of someone doing the exact impossible thing they trained for and not dying yet. That buys us a skew, he said. It will mishear the relay by a fraction. He didn't add if we keep this up, but the sentence lived under his breath anyway. Now we starve it? How? He nodded at the notebook I'd set open on the floor so we could both see. His eyes flicked to the first spread. Tag the room with a name it will mispronounce. It cannot hold a broken word, he said. Your mother found that by accident. She mislabeled a file at 3 in the morning. The ward tried to learn the wrong syllables. It frayed the lattice in that corner. Light came through. Give it a lie in the shape of a word, I said, remembering the margin note. It will spend itself mending a cut that goes nowhere. Yes, a word with edges you can keep straight and it can't. The dish, overhearing because that was its only art, shivered with intention. Name, it urged in a dozen registers, because nothing in a ward is lonelier than a question it understands. Not yet, Rafe said to it, answering a machine as if that were ordinary. Then to me. Choose something it cannot say without learning how to be human in the one way it can tea. What way is that? He smiled, tired enough, to be honest, to be wrong on purpose. 100 names tried to crowd into my mouth at once. Names of streets, plants, monsters. Names we give ourselves when the old ones grow too heavy to hold. But the room vibrated in a way that sharpened everything small. I needed a blade, not a bouquet. Does it matter what language? I asked. It will try them all. His tone faltered. He caught it again. Simples y hables, teeth and tongue. Give it a trap it thinks is a tree. Maya, the dish said pliantly, trying to help, as if it loved the game where we heard it. Stop listening to your own reflection, I told myself in a voice that wanted to be my mother's and wasn't. I let my eyes drop to the scrawl in the notebook margin I hadn't noticed before. Under tag, mispronounced, she had written in pencil almost too light to read. Make it waste its breath. The bulb popped then. It didn't die. It became a wounded thing, flickering in long, mournful blinks. In the strobed light, the dish moved in frames, not smoothly. Here. Angling. Here. Reconsidering its dignity. Here shining where my mother's touch had once smeared oil on a bolt 30,000 breaths ago. The voices came after first, mine saying, I know which I had not. Then Rafe's careful. Then my mother's. Then all three inside out until meaning went like wet paper and words were just pulp in a hand that could not stop kneading. Rafe bowed his head and threw the hold frequency against the weave, as if it were a blanket he could make heavy, enough to keep a child's nightmare from lifting it. He looked suddenly breakable. I had the wild thought that if he fell silent, the dish would be polite enough to stop for the exact length of a breath and then continue eating him like a cat with courtesy. I crouched and wrote a single word on the waxed paper with the stub of a pencil taped to the notebook's coil. The graphite barely took on the slick surface, but the shape stayed. Rafe saw. He nodded once, eyes asking, sure. Because the wrong word is a door, too. I nodded back. The ward didn't yet know the word existed, which made the space around it feel like a cliff edge. Ready? He said. The hum pitched fractionally higher, buying me a syllable's worth of room. The dish found my mother's exact first day of school voice and made it kind enough to kill. "Say your name, sweet girl." It was almost funny. The room didn't know how funny. It did not know anything that wasn't a copy, and it wanted so badly to be original that it had made a throat out of us. I stood. My legs felt hollow, but not weak. Hollow like flutes. Like things made for a resonance that wasn't always a wound. The salt ring clicked once beneath my left shoe, a single crystal adjusting itself the way bones settle between one posture and another. I looked at the dish and spoke toward my own light, so the beam would carry the syllables to the metal. I kept my voice level in the way you steady a measuring cup. We afraid to spill, but because spilling would insult the recipe. "My name is Marrow," I said. It dove at the word like a gull at something shining. "M," the dish said. "Pleased. M-R." The R snagged. It tried again. Once, twice. "Me-ro, mare." The lattice tore where it had woven my mother's voice into Annette Tada's biography. The tear didn't look like anything. It felt like a draft under a door you didn't know was there. Rafe's tone slotted into the rip the way a wedge slides into a cut wood invites. The dish stuttered, and for the first time since I'd stepped into the room, the mirror showed a stranger. It tried another tactic, Mermaya. It corrected itself triumphantly, and the triumph made it clumsy again. No. I did not look at Rafe because he was busy holding the universe level. "Mero," I said, and the second time I let the L lengthen into a vowel. A human would finish with a smile, and the ward would finish with teeth. "Mero? Mervo." The room hiccuped. Furious, sparks ticked along the cable sheathing and died. The bulb became unsteady starlight. Dust fell in slow rain. The notebook, breadcrumbs page lifted in the draft from nowhere and lay back down with a different sentence on top. That was only my clumsy mind arranging luck into omen. The sentence, underlined twice in red, had been there all along. when it fails to say the word 3 times. Push when it succeeds. Run when you don't know which it has done. Listen to your bones. Rafe's tone frayed. He spit copper, wiped it away with the back of his wrist, as if wiping his mouth in a field. He nodded, just once, and I understood that we had entered the span of minutes human bodies consider expensive. I put my palm against the cold concrete of the passive node again and felt the knot sound of the City S relay stirring and the ward already lifting its face toward it to be kissed in greeting. I thought of how many times upstairs a computer had said, "Signal test complete," to no one who would breathe that in and feel safe going back to bed. "Marrow," I said again, one last time, because the room had earned my cruelty. The dish lurched forward as if it would step off its plinth if it could. It couldn't. The ring of salt shifted in the thin draft as if nodding. The concave face flexed and for a split second held, impossibly, an image. Not my mother-s features. The ward wasn't he. A camera but the contour of a woman-est. Listening, it collapsed the next instant into dull metal. "Push," Rafe croaked. "Push. What? Everything you are not," he said, and for the first time let the hum drop to a raw human whisper. "Let it think the word holds your shape when it doesn't." He trusted me to know how. That was either faith or exhaustion. It was enough. I turned the oscillator in my fist and slammed the cracked plastic casing against the junction box hard enough to knock the skewed washer out of alignment and into a worse angle. The feedback peeled up like lacquer. The dish tried to gather itself around the bad signal, as if it were a blanket, and instead found itself naked. Up in the wards, the sealed doors I had passed without touching sang a single glassy harmonic. I felt in my molars down here. The concrete node admitted nothing. It simply stayed colder than the rest of the world ever lets you be, and being honest made it invincible. The relay stirred the way a sleeping city stirs. Elevators dreaming about being rivers, traffic lights practicing sunrise, a pale twine of sound I would have called electrical. If that hadn't been a lazy word drifted down the cables, the ward opened its throat to answer. Rafe raised his head and gave the hold frequency back to the world like a gift that had cost all his teeth. "Now," he said, through a voice with no blood left in it, let it mispronounce home. And the dish, eager to please the mother it had built out of everyone we loved, tried to say home the way a person with a mouth says it. It failed. "Home," it said, silly as a child. "Home. Home." Something in the lattice that had taken 15 years to tighten came loose like a belt unbuckled under a coat. The air moved over my knuckles. My bones told me what my ears refused to celebrate. A seam had opened in the quiet. Not a door. Not yet. A promise of one. The bulb flickered its last and went black. Darkness pooled. In the new dark, the dish began to speak in all the voices at once. Not because it had become better, but because it had become angry. Names rained down around my head like coins in a cheap magic trick. Maya, Miriam, Rafe, technician, daughter. Still, open, stay. The room pleaded, ordered, begged, practiced. I pressed my back to the concrete where no word could find a purchase. "Don't answer," Rafe said. though he couldn't have heard me consider it. Silence is the only sentence it cannot finish for you. Something climbed the stairs that no longer existed above us. That was only a way of saying the pressure changed, as if a heavy thing had shifted deeper into the building. The floor tilted a degree. Sweat ran down my spine in a cold that had nothing to do with air. "Midnight and 3, Rafe said, and his voice had the flat of someone counting not time but chances. "When the city speaks, it will want to sing harmony. If it says the word right, we run. If it says it wrong, we finish the lock. And if we can't tell," he let out something that might have been a laugh once, before this room shook everything funny out of it, "then you do what your mother taught you. You listen to your bones and not your fear." The dish quieted, suddenly, as if it had remembered a lesson from a previous hunger, that you catch more with patience than with noise. In the hush, I could hear the tiniest granular shift from the salt ring as individual crystals settled back into a circle and decided, for now, to be strong. "I brought the second key," I said without meaning to, and the sentence surprised me as much as it pleased him. He didn't turn, didn't ruin the moment by showing relief, just said, "Good girl," in my mother's timbre by accident, or maybe on purpose. In another room I would have forgiven him for that. In this one, forgiveness was a luxury we would buy after. The relay's tone slipped into the chamber like a waiter entering a dark theater. Present, practiced, apologetically bright, it said what it had said every night for years with the courtesy of a good civil servant. "Hello." The ward lifted its reflection toward the glass and tried, in the shape of my mother's listening, to answer like something that belonged. My teeth buzzed. The pads on my skull went cold. The oscillator warmed in my palm. A small animal with a secret. Upstairs, 100 rooms that nobody had slept in for a decade. Noticed the air and straightened their sheets. "Ho," the dish said. Rafe gathered himself the way people do at the end of a long sickness, when they decide to stand, and I readied the single word that wasn't mine and was ready to break it against the room again if the room dared succeed. The relay finished its greeting. The ward tried to say home, and the shape it chose told us which way the night would go. The second the clock in my phone blinked to 12 o'clock, the building shifted. It wasn't an earthquake, not a tremor, more like a collective inhale. Concrete, cables, wires, and stone sucking in air that wasn't there. The relay's tone slid through the chamber like a polite knock. "Hello," it said, as it had every night for years, a thread of routine that nobody listened for anymore. The dish tilted upward to catch it, and in my mother's soft voice, it tried to reply. "Home." The syllables fractured on its concave throat. Wrong vowel. Wrong mouth shape. It stuttered once, as if embarrassed, then tried again. "Huh." The error echoed around the salt ring, bent and twisted by Rafe's note. It didn't match. It couldn't. And in that failure, tiny, sharp, humiliating, the lattice shivered. Something unseen split. I felt it in my bones before my ears, like seams of ice cracking underfoot, except the cracks ran through air, through silence itself. The voices that had filled the dish scattered like birds startled from a wire. My mother's timbre dissolved into static. My own echoes warped into nonsense syllables. Rafe's voice became a clipped fractured hum. The ward whatever lay behind IW6 had been forced to mispronounce home. It wasn't dead, but it was bleeding. The dish groaned, metal bending in ways it shouldn't. Its surface dented outward, as though something inside was pressing to escape the false word. Sparks spat along the cables, fizzing across the stone. I clutched the notebook tighter. One page fluttered open to a red scrawl I hadn't noticed before. When the lattice phrase, "push with lies," a net of truth breaks, a net of falsehood tangles. I looked up. Rafe, we have to keep it talking. But wrong, over and over. His face was pale, streaked with sweat. Blood slicked his upper lip. He'd bitten his tongue to keep the tone steady. You understand? His breath rattled. It doesn't choke on silence. It chokes on error. The dish twisted toward me, desperate now, voice glitching through registers. Technison. Key. Daughter. Wrong, I whispered, stepping closer to the ring. I'm not a daughter. I'm a door. The dish convulsed, repeating, "Dodare." Dora. It stumbled. The syllables fell apart. The salt ring shimmered. Rafe's note flared. Then cracked. His knees buckled, but he forced the sound back up through his throat. A raw growl of tone. Again, he gasped. Give it another. I looked down at the notebook. My mother had underlined a phrase 3 times. Never hum along. The room will take your breath and think it's a gift. A bitter laugh clawed out of me. Fine. Then it can have something poisonous instead. I squared my shoulders and said clearly, My name is Marrow. I was born in the river. My bones are salt. The chamber pulsed. The dish tried Merho. Rerifa. Salt. The words fractured, jagged as glass. The cables spat sparks again. The relay's polite hum faltered for the first time, as if confused by what it heard returned. Good, Rafe rasped. His voice was nearly gone. His tone wavered. His whole body shook with the effort of holding it. You can't keep this up, I told him. He coughed, spat blood into his palm, and smiled grimly. I never meant to, the dish hissed. Naiva. Ma mère. Salt. The salt ring cracked in one spot. A jagged fracture split outward like a lightning bolt across the floor. I froze. Rafe, circly. Not yet, he barked, voice raw. Don't let it break all at once. Keep feeding it wrong. The dish steadied suddenly, too sudden. Its metal surface flexed inward, concave deepening. Then it spoke in perfect clarity, not glitching, not broken. Smooth. Maya, Istopi. It was my mother's voice. Not warped, not static. Perfect. Every nerve in me went rigid. The headset pads burned cold against my skin. Maya, she said again. Don't hurt it. It isn't a monster. It's a patient. That's what I called it. A patient. It only repeats what it's been taught. My throat tightened for a moment. Against every warning, every note in the book, I almost stepped forward. Then I felt the brass key in my pocket. Cold, solid, And I remembered Rafe's warning. Don't answer with your relationship. Answer with a job. I forced the words out. Technician speaking. State your condition. The dish hesitated. The perfect voice cracked. Hungry. And the chamber convulsed. The floor tilted. Dust rained from the ceiling. The salt circle shattered in 3 more places. The dish bent violently, concave snapping into convex, as though something inside had finally decided to be outside. Maya! It screamed now. Dozens of voices layered into one, human and inhuman alike. Marrow! Door! Hungry. Home. The last word rattled every bone in my body. The O stretched like a howl. Rafe collapsed fully, his hum dying in a choked gasp. His head lolled forward, blood streaking down his chin. Rafe. I lunged, caught his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, glazed, but furious. You finish it, he croaked. Lock it. The dish began to split. Its metal surface cracked down the center, spilling a lightless void that pulsed like a second heartbeat. My mother's handwriting burned in my memory. Quartered pause. Quarter turn. Press. Palm. Say still. Don't mean it. 7. The push. I yanked the brass key from my pocket. It hummed, vibrating against my palm. The lock on RW6 wasn't here, but the lattice was. And the key didn't need the door, it needed the command. I lifted it high, shouted into the roar of the room. Still, but in my mind, I pictured everything that wasn't still. Birds in flight, water rushing, cities alive with sound, children laughing, tires on wet pavement. The word hit the dish like a hammer. The cracks widened, the mirror shattered. The chamber went white not with light, but with silence so pure it erased itself into brightness. I fell to my knees, clutching the key to my chest. The last thing I heard before everything collapsed was Rafe's ragged whisper. You broke its name. When the silence lifted, the dish was gone. No debris, no wreckage, just an empty plinth. Cables cut and frayed, ends smoking faintly. The salt circle had dissolved into fine dust. Rafe lay unconscious, but breathing shallowly. I dragged him clear of the ring, my muscles trembling, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would bruise my ribs. In my hand, the brass key pulsed once, then cooled. The notebook lay open on the ground, pages fluttering though no air moved. The words shifted as if written anew. You cannot kill a patient by starving it. You can only send it back to the ward. My stomach dropped, because if RW6 wasn't dead, if it had only been pushed back, then the real fight was still ahead. And I was the only one holding the key. The silence didn't break, it thinned. It drew back from the walls like fog retreating from headlights, revealing not clarity, but space and negative, bright emptiness that made my skin aware of itself. I lay there with the brass key cooling in my fist and Rafe's breath brushing my wrist in shallow, rugged passes, and waited for the room to decide whether we were still invited. The plinth was naked. No dish, no broken metal, no satisfying wreckage to point at and say we did that. Only the knotwork of cables, ends blackened and curled, like hair after a candle. The salt circle had unraveled into I could smell it bleach dry, faintly sweet the way old paper smells when it dies. Rafe, I whispered. His eyes found focus sacramentally slow, as if the act of seeing was something he had to beg back from the ward one favor at a time. He touched his throat habit hand, frowned at the absence of a hum. The habit had worn grooves down his nerves, stopping put him at the edge of a cliff. "Don't try," I said, catching his hand before he could push a tone back into being and spend what he didn't have. "Listen instead." He squeezed my fingers once, a slight, grateful pain. Then he sat deliberate, an old man's carefulness in a body that wasn't yet old, and listened. "There is a moment after a storm when the world decides whether to go back to pretending." The chamber had that on it. The stone held its breath like a diver. The passive slab of concrete behind the junction box stayed stubbornly honest-cold, dumb, unenchanted, and the hallway beyond the threshold, the one we had descended by, was no longer there. The stairwell had skinned itself closed. Where open steps had fallen into darkness a few minutes ago, there was now a smooth continuation of wall, poured and seamless concrete, with the faint tide marks of a foam board removed when the mix was young. No seam, no handle, no lie to pry. It closed the mouth it kept us in, Rafe said softly. He crossed himself without a cross. "It prefers the other one." "What other one?" He pointed. Not back. Forward, opposite the passive node. Where the chamber's far wall had been stubbornly geological and uninterested in us, an opening rippled into existence. Not by magic, by patience. Stone that had pretended to be whole remembered it had been poured around something once, and that remembered seemed side apart. Cold air breathed up from below, wearing damp on its skin. My light traveled into the opening and fell down a slope that wasn't staircase or corridor, not man-made, not entirely natural. The walls glistened, porous stone wet like the inside of a mouth. "The way down that isn't the stairs," I said. My mother's marginalia walked through me like a ghost with warm hands. Rafe let his head rest against the wall a heartbeat longer than a breath. "It wants us where it learned to be itself." "Wants us," I said, and the word had too much agency for a patient and not enough for a predator. "Or needs us." "There isn't a difference at the end of a hunger," he said. I tucked the notebook inside my jacket, retightened the bone pads against my temples, and helped him to his feet. He turned his head away when he coughed. Blood threaded his spit like the red line on a map. "I pretended not to see." "Say nothing," I reminded him. "Have to make the words real in the air. Have to remind myself of the scrawl above a door I'd never actually seen." He nodded. "But even a nod makes noise in a place that eats it." We stepped to the new threshold. The slope began as an incline a person would accept without complaint. The floor was rough, composed of fused grains that seized the rubber of our soles and told us to mind the descent. The air tasted the way a cavern tastes. Metallic, wet, an old coin kept under the tongue of the earth. When my light played over the walls, it revealed spirals etched into the stone, shallow at first, then deeper. If I kept the beam on them more than a few seconds, the spirals seemed to move, not in the light, but in the looking. Waveforms, my mind supplied, grateful for any metaphor that felt like work rather than fear. Not drawn but carved. Not one but layers fundamental. First overtone, second stacked, braided, slipping in and out of phase. If I pressed the pad of my finger into a groove, bone picked up a faint, obedient vibration, like an animal briefly letting me lay a hand on its flank as it breathed. "Don't," Rafe murmured. "I won't," I lied, because I would again if the shape of the groove fit my finger too perfectly to resist. We went down. The corridor narrowed and widened in the way natural caves do when water does. Know that architecture likes symmetry. A pinch to shoulder scraping, a sudden bloom into a chamber the size of a small garage, then a choke point that made our breath loud enough to hear around us. I tried once, on instinct, to clap my childhood in canyons flickering under my skin, and my hands refused. Not because I wouldn't let them, because something in the near air held them and told them no. I let them down. The ward did not condescend to scold me. It had subtler appetites. It wasn't silent. It was busy with not sound. Pressure differentials. The audible fact of stone being heavier than air. Water beating in pores, and letting go at intervals too slow to be a rhythm, and too steady to be chance. The headset translated some of it into a comprehensible texture. The rest it left is fact. Hearing your own bones used as a tongue and refusing to be translated is an intimacy nobody asks for. We found a landing that pretended to be a choice. 3 mouths opened, left low flattened, breathing air so cold it grated this right taller, with a faint draft that smelled of rust. Center sloped, lined with spirals so precise it seemed a hand had sharpened them with a chisel. The notebook didn't have a diagram here, but under breadcrumbs my mother had written a sentence I had skipped. Because I didn't want it to exist. Pick the path that hates you least. I stood, head cocked, bones listening, a dog deciding which hand hides the treat and which the blade. The left mouth bit at breath. The right tasted like forgotten machinery. The center watched. The grooves cut into its walls thrummed back at my pulse 1 beat late, as if it knew me already and was polite enough to fake discovery. "Right," I said. Rafe didn't argue. That frightened me more than if he had. He adjusted the strap on his bone set, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and followed. The right-hand passage bent on itself like a paper clip. We walked with shoulders, angled my light, finding graffiti where no spray can had ever hissed. Fingernail scratches, thumbnail-deep words. In no language, and all of them arrows that turned back on themselves, tally marks that refused to count little boxers that might have been doors. Some were fresh, some had been smoothed by fingers until they were only ghosts. 1 set of marks ran in an unbroken horizontal for 30 feet, as if someone had walked with hands out and refused to take them down. "Who else?" I asked, fingers hovering, not touching. "People who wanted to make it different by naming it," Rafe said. "People looking for their own disappeared. City contractors who came to close out the job and found out they were the job." His smile was small and mean. He did not apologize for it. Me. And you kept coming back. It kept staying. The passage ended not in a door, but in a membrane. A wall that was not entirely wall blocked the way. Smooth, black, light absorbent, not tar, not stone. The first time you see the ocean as a child, your head gives you a word that does not fit. This wall was like that. My mind tried to paste words on a tuber. Obsidian. Skinned and eat slid off and fell somewhere behind me. Above the membrane, someone had carved words into the lintel. Not with a nail or a knife. With patience. The letters were desperate and crooked and correct. Say nothing. I read them silently, and the act of not moving my mouth to shape the syllables became an effort so large it had a sound of its own in my head. Beside me, Rafe breathed with his mouth open. The membrane tasted every exhale and pretended not to. "This is it," he said, and his voice already sounded wrong. Slowed, soft, as if the air were thick syrup and words swam through it, blunted. RWO0, I repeated, careful to keep the word in my mouth where my bones could savor it. But the room could not. "The one before they numbered," he said. "The room they found. The room your mother decided to call patience so she could live long enough to study it." He reached out, then caught himself, and a few inches from the surface, the membrane pulsed once as if in thanks for his restraint. "How does it open?" I asked. "It doesn't. You do." He looked at the carved words again. "Or you don't. Do we need what's there to lock what's up? We need what's there to give us a name that can hold." He looked like a man offering a child a match. "Or we need to accept that sometimes Dante is the most technical instruction you'll ever follow." He was shaking, not with dread, but with the horrible joy of someone allowed to bring their whole life to a single problem. "The ward loves people like that. It knows they will pour themselves through any small hole. If you convince them the glass on the other side is their exact shape." I pressed my earbone pad and all near the membrane without touching it. There was noise on the other side, but it wasn't the layering we had learned downstairs. It was a single thing dragging one long sound over a surface until both hated each other. A bow across a string 20 feet wide. A wet fingernail down a geography of slate. It made my molars itch. It made tenderness in me ashamed. The notebook came out of my jacket by reflex. The wax paper cover had kept it clean. The inside pages bore smears now salt, sweat, the grease our fingers make when we try to mark the world as ours. On the page where "say nothing" had been scribbled once and underlined twice, my mother had written farther down, "Softer pencil this tema, confession. You will want to answer. The room will put your mother's hunger in your mouth. It will ask you to complete it with yes. Under that, lighter, almost erased. I shut my eyes, and grief moved through me like a weather front, fast, hard, leaving branches down in its wake. I let 3 breaths go by. On the 4th, I felt my ribs decide to live again. We won't, I said. Won't what? Won't give it the yes it wants. Rafe nodded, and something unclenched between his shoulder blades. Good. Then we can do the stupid part. Stupid! Find the transmitter that answers to nothing, he said. Touch it with what you are not, and make it admit it keeps no record of you. Poetry, I said dryly. Engineering that remembers poetry, he corrected, equally dry. We stepped back from the membrane and searched the small anteroom the passage offered like a waiting room nobody would wait in. The spirals here were almost invisible, etched so shallow even the light couldn't see them unless it looked sideways. I held my beam at a low angle and swept. Rafe ran his fingers along seams on the floor and tapped with his knuckles short. Clever. The way you listen to a war. For studs and secrets. You're looking for absence, he muttered. The place, the waves don't write. Here, I said, and planted my palm on an innocuous rectangle of wall that felt neither cold nor warm, just uninterested. Bone told me nothing. Ear told me less. He came and laid his hand beside mine. It was like touching a picture of a wall rather than a wall. Flat in a way the world never is. No grit, no microscopic catch. It was not pretending to be seamless like the stairs had. It was seamless. That's it, he said. Fierce, loving how scientists talk to birds they've banded and released and then found again. He fished in his pocket and produced a tin the size of a throat lozenge. Inside, loops of wire lay nested like a sleeping snake. He pulled a length free in one end, wing soldered irregular to a coin-thin disc of metal. Counter-resonator. Crude as a nail. It will script you the wrong contour and feed it back to the node. The node will ignore you properly, and that will be our proof it's listening. You built that. Your mother taught me to cheat, he said simply. I took the wire, the little disc, the hum-hacked math of his years, and pressed the disc against the blank rectangle. The metal cooled instantly, then warmed to my skin. I felt precisely nothing. That was the point. Now, he said, and his voice fell back into the cadence of long practice. I'll give you the count. When I say speak, you do. Say anything that isn't a name or a fear. Say math. Say a recipe. Say Moreau if you like. The node won't hear you. That will be our rope. And if it does hear me, then we've already fallen, he said. And this will make a very small difference in how far. He took one breath, set his shoulders, and without trying to summon the hold, tone let a low, simple sound live in his throat. Not a frequency, a kindness. The air softened in the inch around his mouth, as if the world had leaned closer to a lullaby. Now, he said, and the word didn't echo. It planted itself in front of me like a foot on a first stair. I spoke. I did not say my name. I did not say my mother's. I didn't say numbers. The ward likes numbers because they pretend to be doors that cannot be opened. And the ward likes proving such things wrong. I said a recipe my mother had made on Tuesday nights when the lab released her early. Lentils with lemon and garlic. I said it the way she spoke to a child me, when she wanted me to believe cooking was ritual, not scarcity. Rinse, I said, until the water is no longer cloudy. Cover with 2 knuckles of water above the beans. Wait for the first boil and add the salt you smuggled home in your coat pocket. Because the lab had more and the house had none. When the house asks, is this enough, say yes. And add a lemon anyway. The membrane did not ripple. The blank rectangle did not notice. The wire stayed stupid in my hand like a child refusing to perform the trick it knows for strangers. I smiled. It was not a good smile. It was mine. It didn't hear you, Rafe breathed, and his relief was so bright it hurt. Good. 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 Behind the membrane, something changed its weight from one side to the other. The whole room felt the redistribution. Gravity is democratic that way. We have to go in, I said. The sentence was an object. I could see its shape in the air between us. He swallowed. Or we can go back and try to complete the Locket 6 with only what we have. Do you believe that will hold? He didn't lie. No. Then we go in. Say nothing. Say nothing, I echoed. And this time I felt the words slide under my tongue and lie there obedient, like a pill that would not dissolve until the ward told it to. I lifted my hand away from the blank rectangle. The membrane pulsed as if sensing an animal standing outside a tent. Rafe slipped the coil of wire back into his pocket like a rosary. We looked at each other, the way people do at the edge of a bridge whose rope looks older than memory and newer than hope. Ready? He said. No, I said, and smiled without mirth. Now, I stepped forward and laid my palm flat on the membrane. It was nothing I can ride will be the thing. It was warm, but not with heat. With intention, like an animal's flame. It didn't yield, but it didn't resist. My bones felt their own picture reflected back at them and told me it wasn't accurate, and the error made my stomach lurch. I pressed, not hard enough to tell the room this is a yes. That is not for you. The membrane let me through. There was no door movement, no hiss, no spectacle. The world on one side stopped and the world on the other started, and my body did its ancient trick of making me believe continuity had been maintained for my comfort. The chamber beyond was not large. It had the feeling of a heart muscle, curve, pressure. The walls were black in the way deep water is black, absorbing my light until the beam seemed embarrassed by its own poverty. The spirals here were not carved. They were grown, tiny ridges in the surface that felt like a fingerprint too large for any human hand. The floor rose slightly toward the center, and in the center a depression held not water, not light, not air. It held a tension. I didn't step into it. Rafe came through behind me and stood too close because human beings stand close when the world is too loud to be believed. He touched the back of my sleeve. I knew it was to find me, in case the room unthreaded our senses. It felt like gratitude trying not to beg. We said nothing. The chamber did not. It had one sound, long and so quiet it would have been called silence anywhere else. Here it was, a presence. It moved along the curve of the wall like a hand that would never tire. Once you heard it, you realized you had always known it. It is the sound a person makes when they refuse to sob. It is the violinist's bow drawn so slow the horsehair forgets why it was made. It is a hospital at 3 in the morning when the nurses walk softer than the angels. I did not speak my mother's name even in my head. The depression in the center shivered. A pale glitter rose like salt shaken under glass. It took a shape, not a face, the suggestion of illicit, the contour of a head cocked at the angle people use when they want you to forgive them. Because their hunger was a theory first and a sin second. Maya, my mother's voice said, behind my bones, not through the chamber. A memory slid under memory and wore it like a shawl. Maya, don't open this one. The words landed in the center of my chest where the key lived now, even when I wasn't he. Holding it, I closed my eyes not to weep, but to keep the image of not opening from leaking out where the room could eat it. Rafe made a sound. Not words. A dissent. A plea. I felt him draw breath to say, "We have to." I put my hand back behind me without turning and pressed 2 fingers against his ribs. Say, "Nothing." His breath hiccuped, then ranked itself back into obedience. The depression glimmered again. The chamber's single sound shifted half a hair. A new thing entered it. A filament that hadn't existed an instant before. Hungry. Not a plea. An inventory. I took the notebook out without looking at it. The page I needed was already there because my mother had known I would be this stubborn and had built her love into the binding of paper. If you must stand in RW0, and if you must ask a question, ask it of the silence, not of the room. Silence will not answer. That is how you will know you are not lost. I stood, listening to, not answer. My mind reached for a question like a foot reaching for a stair. What do you want? Is a poor question for a patient or a predator. What will close you is worse. How did she go? Would take my throat and salt it with something I could not spare. So I asked the only question left that wasn't a trap. Where is the transmitter that answers to nothing? I said inside my head. To the silence, not to the room. The silence kept being itself. The chamber's sound did not hitch. The depression did not pulse. Rafe did not shift his weight. A drop of water fell somewhere far away from this place and was ignored by all parties. Good, my mother's script said without saying. Good girl. I stepped sideways, never toward the depression, and ran my left hand along the wall lightly as a person petting a feral animal that has consented to proximity. Feel for absence, I told my bones. It was 5 steps clockwise from the entrance slit, a small circle flatter than the rest. Not visible. Not audible. The counter-resonator wire warmed in my pocket like it wanted to play. I took it out, peeled the disc free, and pressed it to the spot. Nothing happened. Perfect. Rafe's hand found my elbow. He was shaken again, but not with fatigue. with hope. If the node lives here, he breathed without breath. We can, the chamber answered him with politeness, a pressure that felt like a palm to his mouth. He closed it. We stayed with our backs to the wall and our faces turned away from the center like two caretakers refusing to meet the patient's eyes while they put the needle in the arm. I clicked the little oscillator again, the one D used upstairs to bruise the repeater SX and tan counted inside my head this time. No words. My ribs did the math. The disc hummed a dissonant grace note, and the blank node ate it without satisfaction. Behind us, the membrane shifted, reminding us that doors can close around you as easily as they open before you. Now, Rafe mouthed, not trusting the air. I nodded. We did not lock RW0. You cannot lock a room that is also a question. But we tagged its spine with a word it could not say, even if it used our mouths for 1,000 years. Not marrow that belonged upstairs. A different edge. I wrote it on the inside of my cheek with the pressure of my tongue, so the room couldn't see. Then I pressed my palm against the blank node and pushed my refusal through the little disc into the part of the world that keeps no record of us and asked it to keep keeping. The chamber's long sounds scraped, caught, recovered. The depressionist glitter soft as if someone had inhaled a sob and decided to turn it into a lullaby instead. The membrane behind us loosened like a good bandage. My bones told me the seam that had opened upstairs at 6 had not closed. It had learned our shape and decided to hold. I turned slowly, the way you move in a room with a sleeping animal, and touched Rafe's sleeve. We left RW0 without saying yes. The membrane did not argue. The hallway beyond felt almost cheap after that. Stone that is only stone. Air that remembers it is made of molecules. Our footballs landed and did not get eaten entirely. A little Levitian pie survived long enough to tell the next step we were still ourselves. At the first bend, the ward tried one more trick. A voice slid along the spirals toward my ear and picked my childhood like a lock. May, come back. You forgot the lemon. It was a good trick. It reached into the place where love and hunger share a border and waved a flag. I did not answer. I let the silence answer for me. It kept being itself. We climbed. When we reached the chamber where the dish had been, the air felt like a shirt that had been slept in and then shaken out and put back on. The relay's nightly courtesy had long since wandered off to other, less haunted half-dead machines. The plinth didn't pretend to never have held anything. Rafe touched it once, as if to thank it for being empty. Back to 6, he said, voice steady enough to make me want to cry with the normal shape of it. We finished the lock while the lattice is dumb, and the name is broken. And then, he said, and the line around his mouth softened into something I had not seen on his face, yet humor with nothing cruel in it. We go outside and you and I will stand under a sky that does not care whether we are real, and we will yell Miro at the moon until the coyotes complain. I laughed. The sound startled both of us. The room let it be. We took the slope that had been stairs, now poured seamless. The building rearranged itself graciously for our exit. Because we did not ask permission, RW26's corridor breathed us onto its bend with the politeness of a butler who has decided you belong. The plate above the door was the same dark metal, oil-smudged with years of hands that loved screws. The keyhole waited. Rafe lifted his hand toward the intercom and stopped. Remembering, he looked at me. "Ready," he said. "No," I said, and the word tasted like strength. "Now." I slid the key into the lock of RW6 and felt the whole building lean toward the seam to learn whether we would say yes. We said still, and did not mean it. The door of RW6 waited like a question. The plate above it, dark metal, smudged by years of hand, seemed warmer than the air around it. My flashlight trembled against the seam, showing only dust and rust. Nothing unusual, but my bones told a different truth. The door was listening. The brass key pulsed faintly in my grip. Not humming. Now breathing. Rafe stood beside me, one hand pressed flat against the wall to steady himself. He looked drained, almost translucent, yet his eyes were alive, burning with something caught between defiance and awe. "Last step?" he whispered, his voice rough. "We lock it before the lattice finds its rhythm again." My mother's notes had given me the sequence. Quartan. Pause. Quartan. Palm. To steal. Say. Still. The instructions were simple, but the weight in my chest told me simplicity didn't mean safety. I slid the key into the lock, smooth, too smooth, as if the mechanism had been waiting. First quarter turn. The door inhaled. The seam glowed faintly with a pale salt-white shimmer. Pause. The floor beneath my shoes vibrated with something patient, something shifting its weight. Second quarter, the intercom above the door coughed, static, then cleared, then spoke in a voice I had not heard in 15 years. Maya, my mother, perfectly hers, not warped. Not broken. The exact timbre I remembered from childhood mornings when she called me to breakfast. Rafe flinched. Don't, but my throat was already tight, my teeth already parting. I pressed my palm against the steel before the word Mom could escape. Still, I said aloud, but in my head I screamed every opposite. Rivers rushing, storms raging, trains racing down tracks, the chaos of cities alive. The door shuddered, the hum rose sharp, climbing a ladder of impossible notes. The corridor convulsed. Dust rained from the ceiling. The other ward doors sang faint, dissonant harmonics, like a choir of locked mouths. The seam of RW6 bulged outward as though pressed from within. A line of pale dust salt sprayed across my shoes. The intercom spat static, then words layered in dozens of voices. Mine, Rafe's, my mother's, strangers I'd never known. Open, stay. Daughter, home. The voices overlapped. Desperate, furious, pleading. Rafe coughed blood into his hand, then pressed himself against the intercom speaker, forcing his raw throat into one last note. It wasn't steady, it was jagged, broken, but the ward recoiled from it like a snake from fire. Now, Maya, he rasped. Turn it, finish it? I twisted the key, the last fraction. The lock clicked soft, almost gentle. The steel under my palm burned hot, then ice cold, then stilled. The seam sealed itself with a hiss like sand poured onto flame. The shimmer vanished. For one heartbeat, silence. Then, a tone erupted. Not from the door, from everywhere. A deep, resonant chord that pressed my ribs inward and rattled my teeth. My vision blurred. My bones thrummed. The notebook fluttered open in my jacket pocket. A phrase glowed in my memory. Whatever you name, you shrink. Whatever you lock, you carry. The realization hit like cold water. Locking the ward didn't destroy it. It only transferred it to the key. And the key was in my hand. The brass shivered violently, searing my palm. My muscles clenched, but I couldn't drop it. The metal had fused to my grip, embedding itself in my skin. Inside my head, voices whispered not out loud, not through air, but directly through bone. Hungry. Still, daughter. Rafe collapsed to the floor, spent, his note gone. He looked up at me through bloodshot eyes, saw the key smoking in my grip. Understood. It's inside you now, he croaked. The words weren't cruel, they were mournful. I staggered back from the door, clutching the key, my breath ragged. The corridor felt thinner, smaller, as if the entire sanatorium had exhaled at last and left me holding its lungs. Out, Rafe gasped. He pushed himself up, half crawling, half stumbling. We have to go before it learns your rhythm. I hauled him up, slung his arm over my shoulders, and together we staggered through the corridor. The wards we passed stayed silent, their plates dull, their seams unbreathing. For the first time, they felt like rooms, not throats. But every step, the key pulsed hotter, heavier, as if eager to be turned again. We crossed the lobby, the dust-petrified plant, the swollen appointment cards, the warped plastic hall exactly as before. But the silence clung like cobwebs. Outside, the desert night hit like a slap. Cold, open, honest air. Stars sharp above, wind-carrying insect hiss. The sounds of a world that hadn't been taught hunger. Rafe collapsed on the courtyard tiles, sucking air. I stood over him, clutching the key until my skin blistered, staring at the black silhouette of Salt River against the horizon. The sanatorium was dead. The ward was not. Rafe rolled onto his side, coughed, spat red. "You did it. You locked it." "No," I whispered, staring at the key. "I moved it." The voices inside my head shifted, settling like sleepers. "Not waiting." The key glowed faintly in the moonlight. Inscriptions sharper now, RW6, burned into the brass as if newly made. I realized, with a sick twist of certainty, that there would always be another lock, another door, another midnight, and now it would know my voice. Rafe's eyes met mine. Tired, haunted, but steady. "Then don't lose it, ever." I closed my blistered hand tighter around the key. The pain rooted me, real and immediate. In the distance, the desert wind carried the faintest echo, not from the sanatorium, from everywhere. "Miro," it whispered the lie I had given it. The name it still couldn't pronounce, and I smiled, not because I was safe, but because the game wasn't over. We limped toward the car, leaving Salt River behind, the building shrinking into shadow. The key pulsed once more in my grip. A heartbeat, a promise. I knew then I hadn't locked the ward away. I had become its keeper. And keepers never last forever. Maya believed she had locked the ward, sealed it in silence. But silence is only another kind of doorway. The brass key still pulses in her hand, its hunger stitched to her bones. The sanatorium may be behind her now, but the voices whisper in every quiet room, every pause between words, every heartbeat of the city itself. And when the ward learns to say her name correctly, the door will open again. Until then, she is not free. She is its keeper. If you hear your own voice calling you in an empty hallway, remember this story. And whatever you do, don't answer.